23 people died in the blizzard of January 1993. The wind came down from Canada at 60 miles an hour, driving snow so thick and so fast that men froze within sight of their own front doors. Firewood that families had stacked since September ran out in the first week. Stoves that had kept Vermont farmhouses alive through 100 winters couldn't hold back cold that seemed to have a will of its own, a purpose, something personal in the way it found every gap in every wall and pushed through until the inside and the outside were the same. 23 people died in Addison County that January. Not one of them died in the stone house on the ridge above Millhaven. That house belonged to a 62-year-old widow from Minnesota named Ingrid Solberg, a woman the town had decided was strange, wasteful, and not entirely right in the head. They had made that decision 2 years earlier, in August of 1991, when she stood in the heat of a Vermont summer and burned wood in her fireplace, while sensible people were putting up hay. This is the story of what she built and why it held and what it cost her to be right before anyone was ready to believe her. She had arrived in Millhaven in the spring of 1991 with a truck, a trailer, and a set of hand tools that were older than most of the men in town. Her husband Eric had died the previous November. Heart failure sudden in the kitchen of the house they had shared for 31 years outside of Duluth. She had found him on the floor by the stove, and the doctor had told her it was quick that he hadn't suffered, and she had thanked him and driven home and sat in the kitchen for 3 days without eating and then gotten up and started making decisions. The first decision was to leave Minnesota. The second was to come east. She had no family in Vermont, no connections, no particular reason to choose Millhaven over any other small town with granite hills and cold winters, and land cheap enough for a widow on a fixed income to afford. She had driven through it on her way somewhere else 20 years earlier, and remembered the color of the hills in late afternoon and the way the stone walls ran along the road like something the land itself had built to mark its own boundaries. She had thought then that it looked like a place where things lasted. She bought the least desirable parcel available, 2 acres on a north-facing slope above the town, rocky ground that had defeated 2 previous owners and sat empty for 11 years. The realtor told her the soil was too thin for a garden, the slope too steep for easy building, the granite shelf that ran just below the surface too expensive to blast through. She told him she didn't need to blast through it. She needed it. The house she built that first summer was not what Millhaven expected. Most people who arrived from away and started building on an empty lot produced something recognizable. A cape, a colonial something with vinyl siding and fiberglass insulation and a propane furnace that ticked and hummed and kept the interior at 68 degrees, regardless of what the weather was doing outside. Efficient, comfortable. The architecture of people who had decided that technology was the answer to the problem of winter and therefore didn't need to think about winter anymore. What Ingrid built was different in ways that took the town a while to understand and longer still to accept. She quarried the granite herself, not from the shelf beneath her property, which she left entirely intact, but from the collapsed foundation of an old mill building on the back of her landstones that had been lying in a heap for 40 years, waiting for someone who knew what to do with them. She moved them by hand one at a time using a steel bar and a wooden sledge she had built from lumber. She milled herself from 2 downed oaks at the edge of the property. The work was slow. It was also, for anyone who happened to drive past on the ridge road and look up, extraordinary to watch. A 62-year-old woman in work gloves and rubber boots moving granite blocks that weighed 200 pounds, fitting them into walls with a care and precision that suggested she was reading something in the stone, finding the right face. The stable seat, the exact angle that would let one piece lock against another and hold without mortar for a generation. Some of the men in town offered to help. She thanked them and declined. Not coldly, she was not a cold woman, but with the specific quiet certainty of someone who knows that the help, however well meant, would change something about the work that needed to stay unchanged. By September, the walls were up to the first floor windows. By October, with the help of a local timber framer, she paid for 3 days of work. The roof was on. She spent November and December on the interior, the flooring, the plaster, the woodwork, and moved in on the 1st of January 1992 into a house with walls 3 feet thick and a fireplace that was unlike anything anyone in Millhaven had ever seen built. The fireplace was where the trouble started. It occupied the better part of the house's central wall. The firebox was large enough to hold logs 20 inches long, deep and high, built from fire bricks she had ordered specially from a supplier in Maine, and laid with the obsessive care of someone who understood that everything depended on getting this part right. The chimney did not go straight up. It traveled through the interior of the wall in a series of channels back and forth, rising gradually, giving the heat from every fire as many surfaces to touch as possible before allowing it to escape into the sky. From the outside, the chimney looked like something a child had designed. It emerged from the roof line at an angle that seemed wrong, the result of a path through the wall that prioritized thermal contact over simplicity. From the inside, the wall around it was not a wall so much as a storage vessel, a reservoir, a thing designed to absorb heat the way a lake absorbs water, slowly, completely, and to release it the same way, gradually, steadily, long after the source was gone. Ingrid had learned this from her father. Arvid Solberg had been a stonemason in Norway before he came to Minnesota in 1935. A big, quiet man with hands that could feel the difference between granite that would hold and granite that would fail. He had built masonry heaters in the old country, and he built them in the new one for the Norwegian and Finnish farming families in the lake country north of Duluth, who understood instinctively what such a thing was for and why you built it that way and not some other way. He had taught Ingrid the way craftsmen teach, not with explanations first, but with work first, with the feel of the stone and the sound of the mortar, and the sight of heat moving through a properly built channel, and the explanation came later, after the hands already knew. The principle was simple enough to say in a sentence: stone is a bank for heat. You make deposits in summer, and you make withdrawals in winter. The execution was a life's work. What you were building when you built a masonry heater correctly was not a fireplace in any conventional sense. You were building thermal mass, an enormous reservoir of granite and fire brick that could absorb heat, slowly hold it for days or weeks, and release it slowly into the surrounding air long after the fire was out. You burned hot fires with dry wood for 2 or 3 hours, and the stone soaked up the heat, the way dry ground soaks up rain, and then the stone became the heater warming the house, not with flame, but with the patient, steady release of what it had stored. The physics were not complicated. The patience required to trust them was. Arvid had shown her the walls of the old farmhouse where he had grown up in telemark stones that had been heated through generations of summer fires, and that retained a warmth you could feel by placing your palm flat against them, even on the coldest January morning. He had told her that the earth itself 10 feet down stayed at 55 degrees year-round, regardless of what the surface did. He had told her that granite heated to 120 degrees on the inside of a well-built wall would hold that temperature for weeks, releasing it so slowly that the change was imperceptible day to day. He had told her these things when she was young enough that they went in the way essential knowledge goes in, not as information to be filed and retrieved, but as understanding, as a way of seeing, as something that changed permanently the relationship between her eyes and any stone wall she ever stood beside afterward. She had not built her first masonry heater until she was 35 in the house she and Eric had shared, and when she did it, she understood every step of it from inside the way you understand your own name. She started burning in August. The wood she had cut and dried through the spring was stacked against the north wall of the house, 8 cords of it split and seasoned and ready. She built the first fire on a morning in August when the temperature outside was 84 degrees and the air smelled of cut grass and the creek at the bottom of the hill was low and warm. She built it hot. That was the point, not a comfortable fire, but an efficient one, dry wood burning fast and clean at high temperature, producing the maximum heat, with the minimum smoke driving that heat deep into the fire brick and the granite of the walls before the chimney carried what was left of it away. The fire burned for 2 hours. Then she let it go out. The walls were warm to the touch. Not hot, you could hold your hand against them comfortably, but distinctly measurably warmer than they had been before. She would do this again tomorrow, and the day after. Every day through August and September and into October, filling the stone the way a farmer fills a barn before winter. Not for today's need, but for the need that was coming. The smoke rising from her chimney on an August morning was visible from the road. People noticed. The first to come was a boy of about 12 who lived on the farm at the bottom of the hill and who was constitutionally incapable of passing an interesting thing without investigating it. He stood at the edge of her property and watched the smoke, and then watched her stack more wood, and then asked with the directness of children why she was burning a fire when it was hot. She told him she was filling the stone. He thought about this and asked what that meant. She told him the stone was like a battery, and summer fires were how you charged it, and in January, when everything was cold and dark and the wind came down from Canada, the stone would remember August and give the warmth back. He looked at her for a moment with the evaluating expression children use when deciding whether an adult is interesting or simply odd. Then he said, like a savings account. She said, exactly like a savings account. He nodded, satisfied with this, and went home. She learned later that he had repeated the conversation to his father, who had repeated it at the feed store in town, and that was how Millhaven first heard Ingrid Solberg's explanation of what she was doing with the fire in August. The adults found it considerably less satisfying than the boy had. Selectman Gordon Hadley came on the third day of burning. He was a tall man in his late 50s, broad through the shoulders, with the particular kind of authority that accumulates in small towns over decades of being the person who controls things, who gets the road paved, who decides when the woodlot opens, who sits at the head of the table when the town needs to make a decision. He had been a selectman for 18 years. He had grown up in Millhaven and expected to die there, and in the interval had developed a proprietary relationship with the place that made him genuinely useful in some ways and genuinely dangerous in others. He brought two members of the select board with him. They stood at the edge of her property in the August heat and looked at the smoke rising from her chimney, and their faces showed the same expression, a combination of irritation and certainty, that told her the conversation was already over before it began, that they had arrived not to understand but to inform. She came down from the porch to meet them. Hadley introduced himself, which was unnecessary since she knew who he was, and then told her there had been concerns expressed in town about the smoke from her property, and then told her that the woodlot allocation she received as a resident was intended for winter heating, and then told her that burning through August was the kind of thing that made other residents uncomfortable, people who were carefully rationing their own supplies and who didn't appreciate watching someone else make what looked like waste. Ingrid listened to all of this. Then she said, the wood I'm burning came from my own land, not the town lot. Hadley said that wasn't the point. The point was the appearance of it. She said the appearance of someone heating their home. He said the appearance of someone wasting fuel in summer when sensible people are saving for winter. She said, I am saving for winter. That's exactly what I'm doing. He looked at her with the expression of a man who has decided in advance that what he's hearing is not worth the effort of understanding. He said the select board was cutting off her access to the communal woodlot. He said she would receive no further allocation of town resources for fuel. He said she was welcome to use whatever wood she had from her own land, but that the town had to consider the community as a whole, and the community's view was that what she was doing did not make sense, and the town couldn't be seen to support things that didn't make sense. Then he turned and led the two board members back to their truck and drove down the hill. Ingrid stood in the August heat and watched them go. She was not surprised. She had understood from the moment she decided to do this that the doing of it would be visible, and that visible things in small towns attract the attention of people who believe visibility is their concern. She had understood that the smoke rising from her chimney in August would be read as a statement, because in a place this size, everything is read as a statement, and she had made peace with that before she built the first fire. What she had not fully anticipated was the speed of it. 3 days. They had needed only 3 days to decide she was a problem. She went inside and built another fire. The wood from her own land lasted through October. She had more of it than Hadley knew, about 20 years of fallen timber at the back of the property, standing dead and downed wood that had been accumulating since the last owner gave up on the place, enough for 3 winters of conventional heating or 3 summers of masonry heater burning. She had been cutting and splitting it since April. The stacks behind the house were not visible from the road. She burned through August and September and into October, feeding the stone every morning, building the kind of hot, efficient fires that Jonas Hakala had described to her father, and her father had described to her fires that burned for 2 hours and left nothing but clean gray ash and walls that were warmer than they had been the day before. By October, the walls were warm enough that she could feel the heat radiating from them when she sat in the room, a gentle, steady warmth that had nothing to do with any fire currently burning. The stone was learning to remember. What Hadley had not understood, and what she had stopped trying to explain, was the mathematics of it. A conventional wood stove burning through a Vermont winter consumed a cord of wood every 3 to 4 weeks. 8 cords, 8 months, and at the end of it, you had warmth and ash and the knowledge that you had used up everything you had. A masonry heater properly charged through the summer could heat a well-built stone house through a Vermont winter on a fraction of that. Not because it was magic, because it was physics. Because stone at 120 degrees inside a wall, 3 feet thick, holds more heat than any stove could produce in a season. But physics requires patience, and patience requires trust, and trust requires understanding. Millhaven had offered her none of these things. What Millhaven had offered her in the weeks after Hadley's visit was a withdrawal. The invitations that had come in the first months of her arrival to the church potluck, to the Grange meeting, to the informal gathering at the Hadley farmhouse that functioned as the town's real governing body, stopped coming. When she went to town for supplies, conversations ended, a beat too early, eyes slid away the small social lubricants that make a community recognizable as a community were withheld in the particular way that small communities withhold them when they have decided someone is not quite right. She was not asked to leave. She was something more thorough than asked to leave. She was made to feel that she had never fully arrived. 2 nights in October, she heard stones hitting the metal roof of her woodshed thrown from the road below, and she lay in bed and listened to them and understood what they meant. And in the morning, she got up and went back to work. She had been called strange before. She had been called wasteful before. She had been a woman who did things that other people didn't understand for long enough that the incomprehension of others had stopped feeling like an emergency. What she had as a resource was not the approval of Millhaven. She had never had that and was not going to acquire it by being more conventional or more explicable or more like what a 62-year-old widow was supposed to look like when she arrived in a small Vermont town in spring with a truck and a set of old hand tools. What she had was the stone, and the stone was filling up. The first winter came in November. The temperature dropped below zero on a Thursday morning and stayed there. The hills went white, and the creek froze from the banks inward, and the wood smoke of Millhaven rose straight up in the still air. Every household burning through its supply rationing, calculating, watching the stack in the woodshed, and doing the arithmetic of weeks remaining against cords remaining and finding the numbers uncomfortable. Ingrid's chimney barely smoked. She burned a small fire in the morning for cooking. That was all. The walls did the rest. In the front room where the thermal mass was greatest, the temperature never dropped below 62 degrees. In the bedroom backed against the central wall, it never dropped below 58. She walked through her house in a wool sweater and felt the warmth coming from the stone. The way you feel a person's warmth when you stand close to them. A steady, quiet bodily heat that had nothing to do with any fire currently burning. She knew people were watching. She knew because she could see them from the ridge, see their trucks slow on the road below, see figures standing at the fence line for a moment before driving on. She knew because the boy from the farm at the bottom of the hill appeared at her property line one December morning and stood there until she waved him up. And when he came, he asked her if he could put his hand on the wall. She said yes. He pressed his palm flat against the granite of the exterior wall in the spot she pointed to where the heating channel ran closest to the surface. He held it there for 10 seconds. Then he looked at her with an expression that was not confusion and not wonder, but something between them, the expression of a person encountering for the first time a thing they had been told shouldn't exist. He said it's warm. She said it's remembering August. He looked at the wall for another moment. Then he went home without saying anything else. She watched him walk down the hill in the winter light and thought about what it means to understand something through your hand before your mind has caught up, and whether that kind of understanding is more durable than the other kind. She thought it probably was. The town did not apologize. No one came to her door to say they had been wrong. Pride is a more durable material than granite in some respects, and Millhaven had been wrong in an organized institutional way, with a selectman and 2 board members present, and that kind of wrong takes longer to acknowledge than the private kind. But she noticed in January that there were fewer trucks slowing on the road. Not because the curiosity had died, because the conclusion had changed. They were watching a woman with a barely smoking chimney live warmly through a Vermont winter on a fraction of the wood they were burning. They were watching the arithmetic fail to work the way it was supposed to work. They were filing this information away in the place where people file information that doesn't yet have a category. She let them watch. She had nothing to hide and nothing to prove. She had a warm house and a clear conscience, and 4 cords of wood still stacked behind the shed enough for 2 more winters if she needed it. She was already planning the second summer's burning. She was already thinking about how to build the walls thicker, how to extend the channels deeper into the foundation, how to add thermal mass to the north side where the cold came hardest. She was already in the way of people who know what they're doing and why preparing for what came next, laying it in against the future the same way the stone laid heat in against the cold patient, deliberate, certain in a way that required no audience and no approval. Outside, the hills were white and the wind was still, and the smoke from Millhaven rose straight into the January air. From the ridge in the warm quiet of her stone house, Ingrid Solberg watched it rise and thought about August. The second summer came early. By the middle of May 1992, the snow was off the hills, and the creek was running high and fast with snowmelt, and Ingrid was already at work. Not burning yet, the wood needed to be dry before it was worth burning, and she had learned from her father that patience at the preparation stage saved you from waste at the burning stage. She was cutting, splitting, stacking the new wood in the shed where the sun would find it, and the wind would move through it, and the moisture in the grain would gradually surrender over the weeks ahead. She had also been building. Through the winter, she had drawn plans, working at the kitchen table in the warm quiet of the stone house with pencil and paper, and the specific kind of thinking that masonry work requires, not the fluid, intuitive thinking of someone improvising, but the deliberate, load-bearing thinking of someone who knows that every decision made on paper will eventually have to be lifted and set in mortar and live with the consequences of itself for a century. She wanted to extend the heating channels into the foundation. The original construction had been good. She knew that she had felt it through the first winter, felt the way the walls held their temperature and released it slowly and evenly, the way the floor above the crawl space stayed warmer than it should have by any conventional accounting. But good was not the same as complete. The foundation was granite thick and sound, and it sat on the bedrock shelf that ran beneath her property. And if she could connect the heating system to that mass, if she could bring the channels down into the foundation courses and let the summer fires warm stone that went all the way to bedrock, the thermal reservoir she was building would be larger by an order of magnitude than anything she had yet attempted. Her father had told her about a farmhouse in Telemark where this had been done. A house whose foundation had been heated for so many generations that the stone at the base of the walls was measurably warmer than the surrounding soil, even in the depths of winter. A house that had survived winters that killed livestock and broke timber frames and defeated every other structure around it. He had told her this the way he told her most things about stonework, not as instruction, but as evidence. Here is what is possible. Here is what the material will do if you understand it and work with it instead of against it. She had understood it at 20. She was putting it into practice at 62 on a ridge above a Vermont town that had decided she was eccentric at best and touched at worst, and the gap between what she was doing and what anyone watching could see did not trouble her the way it once might have. She had learned in 62 years that the gap between what a thing is and what it appears to be is not a problem to be solved. It is simply a condition to be endured until time closes it. She broke ground on a foundation extension in early June. The work was harder than the original construction. Working around an existing structure, opening the foundation courses without compromising the load path, threading new heating channels through stone that had already settled into its permanent configuration. This was the kind of work that required not just skill, but a certain quality of attention, a willingness to stop and look and think for an hour before making a single move. She did not hurry. The people who drove past on the Ridge Road saw a woman in her 60s working alone on a construction project that looked from the road like something between a renovation and a mistake. They saw stone moved and mortar mixed and a trench opened along the north foundation wall. They saw tools they didn't recognize being used in ways they didn't understand. They saw smoke from her chimney on summer mornings and smoke on summer afternoons, and no visible progress in any conventional sense, nothing being made larger or more finished, or more like what a house was supposed to look like when someone was improving it. What they saw, in other words, was confirmation of what they already believed. Selectman Hadley drove past twice in June that she noticed slowing the truck to walking pace on both occasions, not stopping. She did not look up from her work. She was not performing for an audience, and she would not pretend otherwise. By the end of June, the foundation channels were in. By mid-July, she was burning. It was Deputy Caleb Marsh who came in the last week of July. He arrived in his official truck, the green and white of the county sheriff's department, and parked at the edge of her property line. In the official way, the way that means I am here in an official capacity, and got out and stood by the vehicle with his hat in his hands, which somewhat undermined the official quality of the arrival. He was in his mid-40s. A local man she knew born in Millhaven had gone away for a few years and come back. He had the look of someone who had spent enough time in the wider world to know that things could be done differently and enough time back home to have mostly stopped saying so. He told her that Selectman Hadley had asked him to come out. He said there had been concerns expressed again about the burning and that his job was to determine whether there was any violation of town ordinance or state fire code. She said, "Come and look." He walked the property with her methodically the way a man does, who is actually looking rather than going through a form. He looked at the wood pile and noted that it was her own timber, which she confirmed. He looked at the chimney and noted that it was functioning correctly, the draw clean and complete, no evidence of incomplete combustion. He looked at the firebox and the channels and the construction of the wall with the careful attention of a man who did not entirely understand what he was looking at, but who was honest enough to admit it. He asked her how the channels worked. She explained. He asked her how long the walls held heat after a fire. She told him days, sometimes a week if the fire had been hot and the wood dry. He looked at the wall for a moment, and then with the slightly self-conscious air of a man doing something that might be considered unusual in his professional capacity, he pressed his palm flat against the granite surface. He held it there. The fire had gone out 4 hours earlier. The day was warm, mid-July, the temperature in the low 80s, the kind of day when the distinction between the inside and outside of a well-ventilated building was minimal. And yet the wall was warmer than the ambient air. Measurably, distinctly warmer. Not the surface warmth of stone that has been sitting in the sun, but a deeper warmth, the warmth of something that had absorbed heat and was holding it from the inside. He stood with his palm against the granite for a long time. Then he took his hand away and looked at it as if the warmth might have left some visible mark. He said, "That's been in there since morning," he said, "since this morning's fire. And from every fire before that, going back to August of last year." He looked at the wall again. He said, "And in winter, when it's cold, the wall is still doing this." She said, "The wall does this all winter. That's what I built it for." He stood in the July sun outside her stone house for a while, looking at the wall, looking at the chimney, looking at the property with the measuring eye of a man recalculating something. Then he put his hat back on and said he would report to Selectman Hadley that there was no violation of ordinance or fire code. She thanked him. He started back toward the truck and then stopped. He said without turning around, "My grandmother had something like this in her house. Growing up, she waited." He said, "I always thought it was just old, that it was warm because the house was old." He paused. "I guess that wasn't it." She said it was warm because someone built it right. He nodded, still not turning around, and then got in his truck and drove down the hill. She went back to her work. The summer wore on and the stone filled with heat. She burned every morning hot fires with the driest wood, 2 hours of high-temperature combustion that drove heat into the granite, the way August sun drives heat into dark soil, slowly, thoroughly building a reserve that the cold months ahead could draw on without ever quite exhausting. By September, she could feel the difference from the previous year. The walls were warmer to the touch at the same stage of charging. The temperature in the crawl space, which she measured periodically with a thermometer she wedged between the foundation stones, was running 4 degrees higher than it had the previous October. The thermal mass was larger now, the channels deeper, the reservoir more completely filled. She expanded one room. It was not a large expansion, 8 feet along the north wall, enough to add a sleeping alcove and a small sitting area that she had no immediate personal use for, but that she built anyway with walls as thick as the original and channels as carefully routed, because she had decided by September that the house needed to be larger than she required for herself, and she had made peace with not yet fully understanding why. Her father had told her once near the end of his life that the best masonry work he had ever done was work he didn't understand the full purpose of until years later. He had said that stonework operated on a different timescale than human planning, that you sometimes built for a need you couldn't yet name and discovered the name only after the need arrived. She thought about this in September as she set the last course of stones on the north extension and ran her hand along the top of the new wall, checking the level, feeling the fit of the individual stones. She was building for something. She didn't know yet what, October came and the cold with it, and the town of Millhaven settled into the particular alertness of communities that have been through enough Vermont winters to know that November is not a month to be casual about. The woodlots were being worked. Stacks were going up beside every house on every road through the valley. The agway in town moved through its supply of kindling and chimney cleaner and stove gaskets, and the informal conversations at the counter were about cordwood prices and whether the farmer's almanac prediction of a hard winter was credible, and the general assessment was that it was credible, that the signs were there for anyone paying attention, that this winter would be a test. Ingrid went to town for supplies once a week. Flour-dried beans, salt lamp oil, the practical stores of a woman who had thought carefully about what the winter might require and intended to be ready for it. She moved through the agway and the general store with the quiet efficiency she brought to everything, making no conversational overtures and receiving none, paying her bill and loading her truck and driving back up the hill. The withdrawal was still in effect. The informal ostracism that Hadley had set in motion the previous summer had settled into something more permanent, more structural, the kind of social distance that stops being a punishment and becomes simply a fact of life. The way a fence becomes part of a landscape after long enough that you stop noticing you're being kept out and start simply accepting that you are outside. She accepted it. She did not like it. She was not a person without a desire for ordinary human connection. But she had learned in 62 years of being the person in the room who thought differently than the other people in the room, that the desire for connection and the willingness to compromise what you know to be true in order to obtain it are different things, and that conflating them is the beginning of a particular kind of interior damage. She had her house, she had her work. She had the stone which was warm and which was in its patient granite way, keeping faith. November came, and then quietly and without drama, Ruth Hadley came. She arrived on a Thursday evening in December when the temperature had dropped to single digits and the road up the hill was icy, and a woman in her late 50s had no particular business making the drive unless she had decided the drive was necessary regardless of the conditions. She was the selectman's wife. Ingrid knew her by sight. They had been in the same room at the Grange meeting early in Ingrid's first spring in Millhaven, before the trouble with the burning, back when Ingrid had still been thought of as a curiosity rather than a problem. Ruth Hadley was a practical-looking woman with capable hands and the kind of face that has spent decades concealing what it's thinking. She stood on the porch holding a loaf of bread wrapped in cloth, and she said, "Gordon doesn't know I'm here." Ingrid opened the door wider. Ruth came in. She stood in the entrance and felt the warmth of the place come at her, and her face changed in the way that warmth changes faces when a person has been cold and is suddenly not a loosening, a release, something going out of the arm and the shoulders that had been held there against the cold outside. She looked at the walls. She walked to the nearest one, the east wall of the front room where the channels ran close to the surface, and placed both hands flat against the granite. She stood like that for a long moment, her eyes closed. She said, "It's real." Ingrid said, "Yes." Ruth said, "I told him. I said I'd heard things. He said people were being foolish, that there was no way a fireplace could do what people were saying." Ingrid said nothing. Ruth said, "How cold does it get in here in January?" Ingrid said, "It hasn't dropped below 60 in 2 winters." Ruth stood with her hands on the wall. She said, "Our house dropped to 42 last February. We had wood, but the stove couldn't keep up with the cold coming through the walls. Gordon would not hear about insulation because his father hadn't needed insulation, and his father's father hadn't needed it either." She paused. "The children who stayed overnight nearly got sick." Ingrid went to the kitchen and put the kettle on. They sat at the table and drank tea and talked for 2 hours. Not about Hadley mostly, about houses, about what makes a house hold against winter and what makes it fail, about the difference between a house that fights the cold and a house that simply stores enough warmth to outlast it. Ruth asked questions, and Ingrid answered them, and Ruth asked more questions, the questions of a woman who had spent decades trying to understand the practical mechanics of the life she was living, and who had been waiting without knowing it for someone who spoke that language. When Ruth left, she stood at the door for a moment. She said, "I would like to come back." Ingrid said, "The door's open." Ruth came back 3 more times before February. She came on the days when Hadley was at the town offices for the regular business that took him away from home on a predictable schedule, and she sat at the kitchen table and asked questions and looked at the walls and once in January asked if she could spend an hour simply sitting in the front room while Ingrid worked just to understand what the warmth felt like when it had time to settle into you. Ingrid said yes to that too. The winter of 1992 to 1993 was harder than the first. Not catastrophic that came later, but genuinely hard in the way that forces a community to measure itself against the season and find the measurement uncomfortable. The wood supplies ran lower than they should have. Hadley rationed from the town lot starting in January, which had not been necessary in the previous 3 years. The cold settled into the valley in a way that defeated the ordinary calculations. Through all of it, the house on the ridge barely smoked. Deputy Marsh drove past twice a week now. She knew because she reheard the truck on the road she had come to recognize the particular sound of his engine on the grade, and she had stopped finding it intrusive and started finding it something closer to companionable. He wasn't surveilling her. He wasn't looking for violations. She understood from the way the truck sometimes slowed at the property line without stopping that he was checking. Not on her exactly. On the walls. On the question that his hand against the granite in July had put there, the question that the winter was answering one day at a time. In February, he stopped. Not at the property line. He pulled into the drive parked and walked up to the porch with a brown paper bag that turned out to contain 2 containers of soup from the diner in town. He said he was passing by and thought she might want lunch. He said this in the specific way of a man who knows that what he's offering is not quite soup, but hasn't found a better way to offer it. She let him in. They ate at the kitchen table, and he put his hand on the wall again, the same wall as July, and this time he left it there longer. This time he said it's warmer than it was in summer. She said it's been accumulating for 18 months. He said 18 months of summer fires. She said 18 months of summer fires and 1 more year of winter fires. The heat compounds. The stone holds more each cycle. He thought about this. He said like interest. She said exactly like interest. He looked at his hand on the wall. He said Hadley isn't going to understand this until he has to. She said, I know. He said, and you're not going to try to make him. She said, I built the house. The house will make the argument when the time comes. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, can I ask you something that isn't my business? She said, you can ask. He said, why are you adding the room on the north side? The extension. It's not for you. She said nothing for a moment. Then she said, the stone needs to be ready. When the time comes, the stone needs to have enough stored that it can carry more than just me. He said, how many more? She said, I'm not sure yet, but I want the capacity there. I want to have built the room before I know I need it. He looked at her across the table with the expression of a man deciding whether to believe something. He said, you think a bad winter is coming. She said, I think Vermont always has a bad winter in it. The question is whether you're ready before it arrives or after. He drove away and she went back to the foundation work she had been doing when he arrived, setting stone in the last course of the north extension, tamping mortar fitting each piece with the care she brought to everything. She was building a room for 12 families. She did not say this to anyone. But her hands knew it the way her father's hands had known things about stone and fire that he couldn't always find words for. She had been building this room since the summer, adding length and height and mass in the patient, incremental way of someone doing arithmetic against a future that hasn't arrived yet. The stone was filling. The fall of 1993 arrived with a particular quality of falls that come before serious winters. A clarity in the air, a sharpness in the cold that arrived earlier than usual. A way the hills looked in the evening light that made older people stop what they were doing and look again and say things they'd said before about the signs. Ingrid burned through August and September, as she always did. But this year, she burned longer into October, pushing the charging cycle deeper into the cold months, feeling in the walls a temperature that satisfied her in the way that careful preparation satisfies not excitement, but completeness. She had 8 cords stacked and another 4 on order. She had dried food stored in the cold room beneath the house where the temperature never varied, where the summer heat of the walls above kept the frost from settling even in the deepest cold. Beans, salt, fish, smoked meat, root vegetables, the stores of a woman who had thought about what feeding more people than herself through a long storm might require. She had the north room finished now, with walls as thick as the original and channels as carefully routed, with enough floor space for people to sleep along the walls if they needed to. She had not told anyone she was building this capacity. She had not told Marsh, though she suspected he had understood more of it than she had said. She had not told Ruth, though Ruth had come twice in September and had looked at the north room with an expression that asked a question she didn't quite put into words. She had not told them because the telling would have required an explanation, and the explanation would have required them to believe something they were not yet ready to believe, and the time for belief was coming, whether they were ready or not. In November, the cold arrived in earnest. The temperature dropped to -12 on a Tuesday night in November and stayed below zero for 9 days. The woodlots were working at full capacity. Hadley was already rationing from the town's supply, which had not happened in November in living memory. Chimneys smoked through the valley, every house burning, more than it had planned on the arithmetic of the winter getting uncomfortable early. On the ridge, barely any smoke. She burned her morning fire and let the walls do the rest, and the walls remembered August, and the cold outside was simply the cold outside present, measurable a fact of the season, but not the governing condition of her interior life. She sat at the kitchen table in the evenings and listened to the wind work at the house and felt the warmth coming from the stone behind her back, the warmth of 3 summers of patient burning, and she thought about her father and about the walls in Telemark that had stood warm through winters, that defeated everything around them, and she understood, in the quiet way that understanding sometimes comes after a long time of working toward it, that she had built what he had described. She had built it right. The question now was not whether it would hold. The question was when the others would need it. She looked at the north room where the walls were warm and the floor was swept clean, and there was space along the walls for people to lay out blankets and sleep against the stone, drawing the warmth from it, the way warmth has always been drawn from good stone by people cold enough to need it. She looked at the stores in the cold room below, enough for a month for more people than herself. She looked at the sky through the kitchen window, the particular sky of a Vermont night when the temperature is dropping and the stars are very bright, and the wind has gone still in the way it goes still sometimes before something large arrives. She went to bed. She had done what she could do. The stone was ready. Whatever came next was coming whether she was ready or not, and she was ready, and the only thing left was to wait for it to arrive. The blizzard came on a Thursday. It announced itself the way serious weather announced itself in Vermont. Not dramatically, not with the theatrical buildup that people who have never been through a real winter imagine, but quietly, with a change in the quality of the air. The night before, a stillness that was not the stillness of calm, but the stillness of held breath, and a sky that went the particular shade of gray that old-timers in Millhaven called a killing sky, meaning it was not done with you yet, meaning whatever it was holding it intended to deliver completely. By Friday morning, the wind was at 40 miles an hour and rising. By Friday afternoon, the visibility on the Ridge Road was 15 feet. By Saturday, the temperature was -22, and the snow had come down in quantities that Addison County had not seen in 3 decades, filling the roads to the fence tops, burying the lower story of every house in the valley, turning the landscape into something that looked less like Vermont and more like a place that had decided to start over from the beginnings without the parts that included human habitation. The power lines came down Saturday night. Not one line, all of them. The ice that had accumulated on the cables through Friday and Saturday reached a weight that the poles could not hold, and they came down in sequence, one after another, each one pulling the next, a sound that carried even through the wind, a series of reports like distant rifle shots moving through the valley from north to south over the course of an hour, and then Millhaven went dark. In the dark and the cold and the wind, the stoves that had always been enough were not enough. The houses of Millhaven frame construction, most of them the thin-walled, practical architecture of people who had trusted technology to solve the problem of winter and had chosen their walls accordingly, began to lose heat within the first 6 hours of the power failure. The electric pumps that moved hot water through the baseboard heaters stopped. The thermostats clicked uselessly in the dark. The propane furnaces that had backup ignition ran until the propane ran out, which for most households happened by Sunday afternoon. By Sunday night, the inside temperature of most houses in Millhaven was below 50 degrees and falling. By Monday morning, it was below 40 in the houses that had the thinnest walls and the least wood and the oldest stoves, and there were children in those houses who had stopped crying because they were too cold to cry, which is a specific kind of silence that anyone who has heard it does not forget. The firewood ran out on Tuesday. Not the personal supplies, those had been running low since Saturday, people burning more than they planned on burning, faster than the math allowed, trying to hold back cold that was stronger than any math they had planned against. But by Tuesday, even the town's supply, the emergency reserve that Hadley had been husbanding through the winter with the careful calculations of a man who prided himself on planning, was gone. He had planned for a hard winter. He had not planned for this. Gordon Hadley stood in his house on Tuesday morning with his hands wrapped around a mug of tea he had made on a camp stove, and looked at the thermometer on the kitchen wall and read 41 degrees, and looked at the wood box, which was empty, and looked at his wife across the room. Ruth was already dressed for outside. She was wearing her heaviest coat and her wool hat, and she was looking at him with an expression he recognized as the expression she wore when she had already reached a conclusion and was waiting for him to reach it also. He said, "The children." She said, "Sophie stopped shivering an hour ago." That's not a good sign. His granddaughter, 4 years old, had been with them since Friday when the roads became impassable. She had been sleeping in the warmest room in the house, which was no longer warm enough. He looked at his wife. Ruth said, "You know where we need to go." He stood there for a long moment in the cold kitchen of his house, in the house he had grown up in and raised his children in, and expected to die in the house whose warmth he had always been certain of, because he had planned for it, because he had managed the town's wood supply with competence and foresight, because he was the selectman. And the selectman's job was to make sure the town was ready. He said, "Ruth." She said, "I know." He said, "I told people she was." Ruth said, "I know what you told people." She picked up the child from the chair where she had been sitting under 3 blankets. Sophie's face was pale and her lips had a tinge of color that was not quite right. "Go get the Morrisons. Go get whoever is nearest." She paused, "And then come up the hill." She walked out the door into the blizzard without waiting for his answer. Ingrid heard them coming before she saw them. She had been awake since before dawn, sitting at the kitchen table with a lamp and a cup of tea, listening to the stormwork at the house. The walls held the warmth without complaint. The temperature in the kitchen was 63 degrees. The temperature in the north room was 61. The cold outside was a fact present and acknowledged. But it was outside. She heard the sound in the wind, not the wind itself, but something moving through the wind, the sound of people on the road below the ridge, voices occasionally, the muffled quality of sound and heavy snow. She put on her coat and her boots and opened the front door. Ruth Hadley came through the gate first, carrying Sophie, moving with her, the focused efficiency of a woman who has decided that the wind and the cold in the distance are simply conditions to be moved through and not negotiated with. Behind her, 3 other figures from the nearest houses. The Morrisons, the Aldrich family, a single figure that resolved itself as Marsh Deputy Caleb Marsh, who had apparently decided that his official truck was not going anywhere in the snow and had walked. Ingrid stepped back from the door. She said, "Come in." Ruth came in, and the warmth hit her the way warmth hits a person who has been truly cold. Not the theoretical cold of a house that has dropped 10 degrees, but the real cold of a blizzard in January, and she stopped just inside the door with her eyes closed for a moment, holding Sophie against her chest. Then Sophie moved. The child had been still against Ruth's shoulder, the particular stillness of a child who has been too cold for too long, and now she moved, turning her face toward the warmth, and then she made a sound, a small, uncertain sound that was not quite a word and not quite a cry, but something between them. The sound of a body that has found warmth and is beginning to believe in it. Ruth looked at Ingrid. Ingrid said, "Bring her to the wall." She led Ruth to the east wall of the front room, and Ruth carried Sophie to it and pressed the child's back against the granite. And the stone was warm, the warmth of 3 summers of burning and 2 winters of accumulation, a deep bodily warmth that had nothing to do with any fire currently burning, and Sophie felt it and leaned into it with the instinctive trust that children extend to warmth the way they extend it to nothing else in the world. The color came back into her face in the time it takes to say the words. Ruth stood with her daughter pressed against the warm granite and made a sound that was not quite crying and not quite something else. She pressed her own forehead against the wall. She stood like that. The Morrisons came through the door, the Aldriches, Marsh last pulling the door shut behind him against the wind. Ingrid said, "There's room in the north room. The walls there are newest, but they've been charging since August. It will hold." The others came over the next 3 days. Not all at once. The blizzard made the ridge road nearly impassable, And the people of Millhaven came to the stone house the way people come to things they have been reluctant to need individually in small groups, when the alternative had made itself clear enough that the reluctance no longer mattered. By Tuesday afternoon, there were 11 people. By Wednesday morning, there were 23. By Thursday, when the wind had begun to ease, but the temperature was still at -18, and the valley below was still dark and still without power, there were 47 people in Ingrid Solberg's stone house on the ridge, and the house held them. Not comfortably in the conventional sense. 47 people in a house built for one is not comfortable regardless of the architecture. People slept on the floors. They slept along the walls, which was what most of them wanted to be, against the walls to have that warmth at their backs. They slept in the north room that Ingrid had built without fully knowing why she was building it, the room with the thick walls and the deep channels, the room that had been accumulating heat since the previous August, and that released it now in the steady, quiet, impartial way of stone that does not discriminate between the people pressing against it. Children slept best. They found the warmest spots with the accuracy of small animals and settled into them and slept the deep sleep of bodies that have been asking for warmth for days and have finally been given it without qualification. The adults sat up in shifts, keeping the lamps going, melting snow for water on the small fire Ingrid kept in the firebox, not for heat, the walls provided heat, but for cooking, for the practical sustenance of 47 people who needed feeding. She had enough stored food. She had calculated in September, when she was laying in the stores, for something close to this number, for something close to this duration, and she had not known she was calculating for this. She had simply done the math that her hands understood and let her mind catch up later. Marsh organized things because someone needed to, and he was the person who had worked out in the months of quiet observation preceding this week that Ingrid's authority in this house was absolute, and that his job was to extend it outward to be the interface between her knowledge and the immediate practical needs of the people filling her rooms. He moved through the house with the efficient calm of a man who has found the right use for himself and is grateful for it, solving the problems that presented themselves. A child who needed a different sleeping spot, an older man who needed water brought to him rather than having to go to it, a dispute over space that needed a quiet word from someone with official standing, even if official standing had been somewhat revised by the present circumstances. He did not say anything to Ingrid about what he had known and when he had known it. She did not ask. What mattered now was what was in front of them, and what was in front of them was 47 people who were alive and warm when they should not have been, and the accounting of how that had come to be was a conversation for a different time. Gordon Hadley arrived on Wednesday afternoon. He had stayed in the valley until Tuesday night, moving between houses, doing what a selectman does in an emergency, coordinating the distribution of what resources remained, keeping people moving, keeping people alive through the first terrible days, by force of will and logistics and the genuine competence he had always had for managing things. By Tuesday night, there was nothing left to manage. The town's reserves were gone. The remaining households were below 40 degrees and dropping. He had carried 2 elderly residents to the Morrison house himself through thigh-deep snow because they could not walk and there was no vehicle that could move and there was no choice. He came up the hill in the dark on Wednesday alone. He had not sent anyone ahead of him. He had not announced himself. He came the way a man comes to a thing he has been avoiding, directly, without ceremony, without the buffer of other people or official occasion. The door opened before he knocked. Ingrid was standing there as if she had heard him on the road, which perhaps she had developed over 2 years of listening to this house and this hill, an attunement to sounds that a person raised here from birth might have had, and that she had built in herself through the practice of paying attention. He stood in the doorway. He was a large man, and the door framed him, and behind him was the dark and the wind and the cold, the January cold of a Vermont blizzard, a cold that had been killing people in this county for 3 days. And inside was the warmth of the stone, the warmth that had been stored patiently through 3 summers of fire he had called wasteful and ridiculed publicly and used his position to obstruct. He looked at her. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "My son's children are in here." She said, "They are. They're fine. Come in." He came in. He walked to the east wall without being directed to it and placed both hands flat against the granite. He stood like that with his back to the room with 47 people arranged behind him in various states of sleep and waking, and he kept his hands on the wall for a long time. When he turned around, his face had the look of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a longer time and has just set it down, not because he chose to, but because the weight finally exceeded what he could hold. He looked at the room. He looked at the children along the walls, at the old man, by the lamp at his daughter-in-law, with his grandchildren asleep against the stone at Marsh, standing near the kitchen door at Ruth, who was watching him from across the room, with the patient expression of a woman who has already done the things she knew needed doing, and is waiting for the man who held it back to understand what that cost. He looked at Ingrid last. He said, "I told people you were wasting wood." She said nothing. He said, "I cut off your allocation. I told the town you were touched." He stopped. "I used every advantage I had to make it harder for you to do this." She said, "I know." He said, "And you built it anyway." She said, "I built what I knew how to build." He said, "And now my grandchildren are alive because of it." She didn't answer. There was nothing to answer. The fact was present in the room without any need for confirmation. He said, "I don't know if I deserve your forgiveness. I'm not asking for it. I'm asking—" He stopped, looked at his hands. He said, "I'm asking if you'll teach me." Ingrid looked at him for a long time. She thought about what it costs a man like this to stand in front of 47 people and say what he had just said. She thought about her father, about what he had said once near the end of his life, about the people who finally understood they come late, and they come hard, but they come, and when they do, the question is not whether they deserve the teaching, but whether the teaching serves the stone. She said, "There's coffee on the stove. Sit down." He sat down. The storm broke on Friday. The wind dropped, first going from a continuous scream to a gust to nothing over the course of an hour Friday morning, and the silence it left was extraordinary after 4 days of noise, the particular silence of a landscape that has been rearranged and is still settling. The temperature rose to -6, then to 0, then on Saturday into the single digits above, and the sun came out over a valley buried in white, everything still and brilliant and so deeply cold that the air had a crystal quality, every edge sharp and exact. The people of Millhaven began to emerge. They came out of the stone house on the ridge and made their way down the hill and went back to their houses to begin the work of assessment: what was frozen, what was broken, what had survived, and what had not. The losses were real. Pipes had burst in the houses that went cold. A roof had come down under the snow weight on the oldest building in town. 2 families had lost everything in their root cellars to frost that had penetrated foundations not designed to hold it off. But no one had died. In a blizzard that killed 23 people in Addison County, in farmsteads and isolated houses, and on roads where people had been caught too far from shelter, in a county of 8,000 people, not one death occurred in Millhaven. This fact was not immediately connected in the news coverage that followed to the stone house on the ridge and the woman who had built it. The coverage focused on the scope of the disaster, on the rescue efforts, on the failures of infrastructure that the storm had revealed. Millhaven appeared in a sidebar as a community where the death toll had been remarkably 0. The people of Millhaven knew why. They did not need the coverage to tell them. They had slept against the walls. They had pressed their children against the granite and watched the color come back into faces that had been wrong colors for days. They had felt the warmth that had been stored in the stone since August 3. August patiently filled and patiently held release itself in the weeks when it was needed most. They knew what they had been given, and they knew, most of them, what they had nearly not been given and why. The town meeting that spring was the largest in Millhaven's recorded history. Every household sent someone. People who had not attended a town meeting in years appeared and took seats in the rows of folding chairs that the Grange Hall could barely contain. And the business conducted was not the ordinary business of road maintenance and school budgets and zoning disputes, though those things were on the agenda. The first item was a resolution to allocate funds for the construction of masonry heating systems for every household in Millhaven that wanted one to be funded from the town's emergency reserve account and from a state grant that Deputy Marsh had spent 3 weeks of the recovery period applying for, working from the table in Ingrid's kitchen, using her documentation and her technical drawings, and a letter of support that he had asked her to write and that she had written in the spare, precise language of someone who understood both the engineering and its purpose. The resolution passed without a dissenting vote. The second item was brought by Gordon Hadley, who stood at the front of the room without notes. He was the selectman. He had been the selectman for 19 years. He had been by any objective measure a competent administrator of a small town, and the people in the room knew this, and it did not make what he said easier to say or easier to hear. He said I was wrong about Ingrid Solberg. He said it simply without the qualifications that make admission easier, without the contextualizing language that turns acknowledgement into explanation. He said he had used his position to obstruct her work. He said he had told the town she was wasteful and touched and not quite worth their charity, and he said every one of those things had been wrong and he knew it, and he wanted it on the record. He said she saved us, not with luck and not with some accident of circumstance. She saved us because she knew something true about stone and heat and winter, and she knew it well enough and was strong enough to build it in spite of everything I did to stop her. He looked across the room at where Ingrid was sitting near the back in the seat closest to the door. He said, I've asked her to teach anyone who wants to learn. She's agreed, starting in June for anyone who shows up. The room was quiet. Then the woman next to Ingrid, a farmer's wife named Celia Morrison, who had slept with her 3 children against the north wall of the stone house for 4 nights, began to clap. And then others. The sound built in the Grange Hall in that particular way that sound builds in a room full of people who have been through something together and are still sorting out what it means. Ingrid sat with her hands in her lap and looked at the floor and let the sound wash over her. She was not a woman who required applause. She had done what she had done because it was the right thing to do and because she knew how to do it, and the doing of it had been its own justification as it always was. But she would not pretend that the sound in this room was without meaning. She had been alone on that ridge for 2 years, and the aloneness had been real, and the cost of it had been real even for a woman who had made her peace with the necessity of it. She let herself hear the room for a moment, then she looked at her hands. She found the letter 3 weeks later. She was doing the work that the winter had made necessary, repointing mortar in sections where the freeze-thaw cycle had opened small gaps, checking the integrity of the heating channels, where the extraordinary cold of January had stressed the system. She was working on the north wall of the original construction, the wall that had been built first and had held longest, when her chisel found a void behind a section of interior facing stone that should not have had a void. She cleared the mortar carefully. Behind the facing stone, in a space no larger than a book wrapped in oilcloth that had kept it dry through 2 decades of the wall's slow breathing, was a small bundle. She brought it to the light. Inside the oilcloth, an envelope. Old but intact, the paper, soft at the edges, but not brittle, sealed with wax that had held its seal. On the front, in handwriting she would have known anywhere in the handwriting of her father Arvid, her name. She sat down on the floor of the room with the envelope in her hands. She did not know how it had come to be in the wall. She remembered she had not thought about this in 30 years, had not had reason to think about it. The summer of her first masonry heater in the Minnesota house when she was 35, and her father had come to help her with the construction and had worked beside her for 2 weeks, and they had talked over those 2 weeks with the ease that work gives to conversations that are otherwise difficult. She had not watched him every moment. There had been days when she was working another section and he was working the section where this wall was. He had told her then that he would not be able to come again. His health was already failing. The long decline that took him 3 years later had already begun, and she had understood that this was a particular summer, a particular construction, a particular 2 weeks that would not come again. She had not known he had left something in the wall. She broke the wax and opened the envelope. The paper inside was a single page written in Norwegian and in English, both the way her father sometimes wrote, when he was trying to be precise using whichever language held the meaning better. He had written, Ingrid, you will be told that what you are building is wrong or wasteful, or that you are wrong and wasteful for building it. People who do not understand a thing often speak with more certainty about it than the people who do. This is not wisdom. This is the sound of fear. Build anyway. The stone does not care whether anyone believes in it. The stone holds what you give it and gives it back when it is needed. That is enough. That is more than enough. It is everything. When the time comes that someone needs what you have built, open the door. That is the whole of it. Everything I ever learned about stone comes to that. Fill it. Open the door, your father. Who loves you and who believes in what your hands know how to do? She read it twice. Then she sat on the floor of her stone house in the early spring of 1993, with the letter in her hands and the walls warm around her, warm still, After the worst winter in 30 years, warm with the heat of 3 summers of patient burning, and she thought about her father's hands on stone and about the boy from the farm at the bottom of the hill who had stood at her wall and understood something through his palm before his mind had caught up, and about 47 people sleeping against warm granite while the world outside tried to kill them, and about Gordon Hadley pressing his hands flat against the east wall and standing there in the silence of a man encountering something that required him to revise everything. She thought about the long patience of stone. She folded the letter along its original creases and held it. In June, she began teaching. 22 people showed up on the first morning, which was more than she had expected, and exactly as many as the space could hold for a demonstration. She had set up the firebox of the north room for a teaching fire, the channels exposed at one section, so the class could see what the heat was moving through and how. Gordon Hadley was there. He arrived first before anyone else and stood at the property line until she gestured him in, and then he sat in the front of the group and took notes in a composition book with the diligence of a man who has decided that the gap between what he knows and what he needs to know is something he intends to close. Ruth was there. Marsh was there. Celia Morrison was there with her eldest son, who was 17 and had inherited his mother's practical intelligence. The boy from the farm at the bottom of the hill was there now, 13, with the specific attention of someone who had been waiting for this class since the morning he had pressed his hand against the wall and felt what was inside. Ingrid stood at the front of the room and looked at the people who had come. She said, "What I'm going to teach you is not complicated. The principle is simple, and the material will do what you ask of it if you understand what you're asking." She paused. The difficulty is patience. Not patience as a virtue, patience as a practice. The ability to do work now for a result that comes months later. The ability to trust that what you're building is building even when you can't see it yet. She looked at the wall behind her. She said, "The stone is a record of every fire you've ever burned in it. It doesn't forget. It doesn't judge. It holds what you give it and gives it back when you need it." She paused. "That's what I'm going to teach you to build." She put her hand on the wall. The wall was warm, not the warmth of a fire currently burning. She had not lit a fire this morning. This was the warmth of what had been stored, the residual warmth of 3 summers and 2 winters of patient work, the warmth of August afternoons, when she had burned alone on the ridge while the town below looked up at her smoke and shook its heads, the warmth of mornings in October and November, when she had added to the account without knowing exactly what the withdrawal would look like or when it would come. The warmth of a woman who knew something true and built it regardless. She stood with her hand on the warm stone and looked at the people who had come to learn, and she thought of her father's letter folded in the drawer of the kitchen table, and she thought of the words he had written in Norwegian and in English, both the words that had waited in the wall for 3 decades to find their moment. Fill it. Open the door. She had filled it. She had opened the door. Outside, the Vermont summer was beginning, the long, warm days that the hills offered in payment for the winters they exacted. And somewhere below the ridge, the town of Millhaven was going about the ordinary business of June, and the season was right, and the stone was ready, and there was work to do. She turned to face the room. She said, "Let's begin."